Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back. Hope you've had a good lunch. Just give people a minute to take their seats. Can you hear me at the back? Okay. Put it a bit lower. Welcome to our second keynote session of the day, which is entitled Challenging the Global Casino by Building Economic and Climate Justice. My name is Greg Ford. I'm a senior advisor with Finance Watch, and it's my pleasure to be hosting this session. And in a moment, I'll introduce our keynote speaker, Anne Pettifor. So over the next almost an hour, a little bit less because we've slightly overrun over lunch, Anne is going to talk to us about the international financial system and some of the problems with its overly speculative nature and the consequences that has for inequality and the climate crisis. And we're also going to discuss some ideas for bringing that back under control so that it can do a better job of serving people and planet. So it's quite a modest agenda for the time we've got available. I should explain the format for this. Anne's going to give a short talk. After that, we'll do another very short fireside chat, so-called. Don't worry, there'll be no real flames involved. And then the fun part, we'll open it up to questions to you from the floor and also to those online. So, and then we'll break at 3:15 for coffee. So Anne is director of a network of economists who promote the ideas of Keynes, called Prime. This network also focuses on the role of the financial sector in the economy. Now, as a political economist, I understand that Anne is an expert in politics and power structures and the very important overlap between those things and economics. And she's used that background to write and lecture extensively on the topics of sovereign debt and international financial architecture. Anne was the leader of the Jubilee 2000 campaign, which led to, I understand, about $100 billion of developing country debt being forgiven, something that Kofi Annan, then Secretary General of the UN, said was an example of how powerful and influential NGOs can be. So I hope that'll be an inspiring example for those of us here who fit that description. Anne was also one of the few economists who not only saw the 2008 global financial crisis coming, but actually did something about it. And while that didn't include mentioning it to the Queen of England, she did publish a book in 2006 called The Coming First World Debt Crisis. And it's possible that Anne may have some other predictions up her sleeve, so I can't wait to hear what she has to say. Anne has also written books called The Production of Money, The Case for the Green New Deal, and she has another one in the works, which we'll hear a little bit about shortly. On a personal note, I've seen Anne speak several times, and I've always felt inspired and educated by the experience. So it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this Finance for Society forum. Anne, the floor is yours.
Thank you ever so much. And first of all, can I say what an honor it is to be here? And secondly, can I congratulate Finance Watch on a fabulously well-organized day of thinking and debating. It's such a relief to be part of an organization that can make sure transport's arranged, that, the environment is a good environment that involves the arts in a debate about finance, but above all, that gives the delegates a decent lunch. Thank you very much. So I want to, if you could start, I'm going to try and get through my slides in the few minutes that I've been given, but it's a big story. Can I have the first of the slides, please? So I am about to publish a book in January called The Global Casino. This is actually an old title. It's really about how Wall Street gambles with money, people, and planet. And I want to talk about it in terms of its impact on ordinary people, on pensions, on the cost of living crisis, on housing, and on the climate. That's what the book does. So the idea behind the book was that I could spend a lot of time thinking about the international financial system, and I was aware that for the person in the street, it was something remote and abstract and complex. And I'm determined that it should be made something that everyone can understand, precisely because it has such a direct impact on some very important parts of our lives. And I've wanted to frame it as a place so that people could understand that it's not some sort of nebulous, amorphous thing, it's a casino. So picture a casino. This is what we're talking about, right? And people can picture a casino, and they know what goes on inside a casino. I know the designer of the book wanted to put in some fruit machines on the front page, on the front cover. I said, no, we're not talking small-time gambling here. We're talking big-time gambling. So could we please have a real casino? And so eventually persuaded him to use these colors. So I want to talk about one man who, in my view, more than any other, represents one of the biggest gamblers in a casino, and his name is Masayoshi Son. At the height of the dot-com bubble in 2000, he was briefly the richest man in the world. When it burst, he lost 97% of his fortune, around $70 billion. He's made more money since then. At the beginning of this year, he met up with President Trump, which is his second big meeting with President Trump, and he's invested billions of his company, SoftBank, into AI. So this is the type of person that occupies this space. He's real, he's a person. His father managed pachinko machines, and his father was part Korean, is Korean, and he's part Korean Japanese. And so, he grew up in a gambling atmosphere environment. And now we have AI, where the biggest gambles of all are taking place. And here this man is amongst those who's about to do all that gambling. And I argue that capitalism's always produced risk takers and gamblers, those who dreamed of, invested in, and built the railways, computers, and the internet. What's different today is that in contrast to railways, computers, and even the internet, AGI does not exist. The AGI bubble may just be a vast techno-dystopian power play designed to put Silicon Valley bosses in political and financial control over a vast, weakened, and global labor force. This is class war at its most brutal. To extend the hype and marketing behind the bubble, tech oligarchs have begun building massive gas-guzzling data centers said to be needed to power the smarter than human machines. We have decided, said Altman, it is time to go make a very aggressive infrastructure bet. But to make the bet at this scale, we kind of need the whole industry, or a big chunk of the industry, to support it. Big-time gamblers have formed. Let me just go back once. Can I go back on this? Please help me go back. No, I'm going forward. Go back. This way to go back. No, can someone take it back for me? Thank you so much. A bit further. Back to Sam Altman. So what? Keep going. How do you go back? There's no going back. This would be terrible. How do I go back on this?
That might go forward.
No, back? Yeah. So, no, this has got to go. What did you do there? This one, right. So this is about the big bet, okay? So Altman has made the big bet. And what the Financial Times have told us, and which is not here, is that your money is going into this bet. If you have a pension, it's very likely that your pension is investing in this bet. We know this because, as McKinsey have argued, retirement funds are being used to finance the data centers. A very large chunk, says McKinsey, of the $7 trillion pouring into data centers between now and 2030 are from pension funds. How many people know that their pension is being used to gamble with data centers and whether or not we will ever have enough energy to drive these data centers? I don't think many people have. And my mission with this book is to say that thing is not beyond your understanding. People are not stupid. They're really quite capable of understanding. In fact, they already have a sort of intuitive understanding of the way the system works and how it works against them. But we can help them understand it even better by framing the communication in these ways and helping them understand how much of their own personal lives at risk, not by local politicians, not by the economists obsessed by microeconomics, not by the fiscal rules of any government, but by that institution, the casino. So Keynes was the first to use the term casino when he talked about the international financial system of the 2020s and 2030s. But actually, the person I'm really channeling here is Susan Strange. And I don't know how many people here have heard of Susan Strange. There's a very few. And how many have read Susan Strange? So she's practically unknown to people like you and me, preoccupied with the international financial system. But she was a heroine back in the 1980s. She invented the field of international political economy at the London School of Economics. And international political economy is something that very few economists bother to work in and understand. But she wrote it there, and she wrote a book called on the casino capitalism. But quite a lot of my work channels what she was arguing then about the size of the financial system. So what I want to argue is that pensions are joined in this big space, the casino, by speculators in food, energy, as well as pensions, and in the unregulated shadow banking system. UK pension funds are cutting back their exposure to US equities, says the Financial Times, amid concerns over the market's growing concentration in a small number of tech stocks and the risk of a bubble in AI. Schemes managing more than £200 billion in assets for millions of British savers are exposed to these schemes, especially if they are defined contribution pensioners. And I'd like to have a discussion about that at some point because they are the most vulnerable. The burden of losses is going to fall on individual pensioners, not the pension fund and certainly not the asset management fund. And that's what's so bad about defined contribution funds. Defined benefit pension funds, by contrast, share collectively in both the gains and probably also in the losses. So to the detriment of the rest of us, while a casino operates in another sphere altogether, it remains tethered to the real bailout economy we live and work in our pensions, cost of living, housing, and our climate. The casino is tethered to the world's bailout institutions, central banks and governments, and via the law for the enforcement of contracts made in the casino's stratosphere, as I call it. So today we know, according to the International Financial Stability Board, set up by Gordon Brown and others after the crisis to oversee, to monitor, not to regulate, but to monitor the shadow banking sector. Shadow banking today amounts to something like $217 trillion of financial assets, which is about half of the world's global total of financial assets, something like 400, have I got it somewhere, $450 trillion. Now, think about these financial assets, is that many of them are bets again. Many of them are invested in assets which are expected to generate returns, and in that sense, they're also liabilities. A pension fund has assets, but it also has liabilities. It's got to pay out pensions at some point, right? The problem is that the income generated by the real economy in the real world, including the economies of China, the United States, Europe, Africa, Latin America, amounts merely to just over $100 trillion in income. So we have these assets that again have real difficulty finding, if you like, resolution in the real economy. And of course, there's also amounted to debt. Now, of course, a lot of those financial assets are invested in oil because as this lovely cartoon illustrates, somehow we need to monetize this and quickly, says the finance sector. So the finance sector thinks monetizing the fossil fuel sector and the crises these will generate is bound to be profitable. And this, of course, is bound to lead to climate and ecological breakdown. So the Wall Street and the global economy is now effectively governed by those active in private global markets in money, not democratic governments or the IMF. And this is, in a sense, what the people, in the purest sense, the populists that they're called, and I think it's used as a term of abuse, really, are perfectly well aware that their governments are not in control of the financial system of the economy in which they inhabit. And they, as Karl Polanyi argued, are looking for protection from these markets. These markets have stripped them of decent, well-paid jobs. These markets are stripping them of decent housing, affordable housing. These markets are stripping them of access to healthcare and education. Right? And furthermore, these markets are precipitating ecological crises. And the people are demanding to be protected from that, and they're looking to strong men and women to do the protecting. And strong men, like Donald Trump, have stood up and said, yes, I will protect you from Mexico. I will protect you from China. I will protect your jobs. I will put America first. And people have responded to that, unsurprisingly. So they're perfectly well aware that their governments no longer govern these systems. But they also are aware of the damage that markets are doing to them. So these operating money markets, BlackRock, hedge funds, private equity companies, have migrated away from national boundaries and democratic oversight and operate in the shadow banking sector. They're generating in that sector, as I've already pointed out, and as someone pointed out in the last session, huge quantities of debt, both private and public debt, corresponding to more than $150 trillion in 2023. And it's grown, of course, since then. And global household and non-financial corporate debts declined to 54% and 90% of GDP, respectively. So that, this is building up liabilities and debts that they're never going to be repaid, same as the financial crisis. And the horror is that while operating out there in the remote stratosphere beyond, if you like, democratic oversight, they are nevertheless tethered to bailout banks. And the response of the authorities after the great financial crisis was the step-by-step construction of a too-big-to-fail regime for Wall Street banks and other financial institutions. Before 2007 and during 2007-08, Wall Street banks could go bust. Today, they cannot go bust. They will not go bust. How do I know? In May 2020, Scott Pelley asked, who's been sacked, by the way, from 60 Minutes, asked the Fed, has the Fed done all it can do? And Powell said, no. There's really no limit to what we can do with these lending programs that we have. Wall Street took note. They know they can't fail. So they want capitulation from the bank. And of course, we also have the crisis. This is causing the climate crisis, global inequality within countries, causing trade imbalances and wars. I hope everyone here has read Pettifor and Klein on trade wars or class wars. And this has, of course, led to social and political upheaval. So that's my story. That's what I want to talk about, and that's what I want the public to understand with my book and with the work that I do. And then, of course, I'm going to be asked, what is the answer to this problem? What do we do? And my answer is a simple one. We follow the Americans. We look at the thing that was published in the summer called the Big, Beautiful Bill. Section 899 of that bill calls for capital controls, calls for controls over the movement of capital into Wall Street, into the United States of America. Movement of finance, which Stephen Moran, who's now on the Federal Reserve Board and is Trump's nominee on that board, has argued flows of capital, in particular from China, that sells into the American market and uses the capital raised from those sales to invest in Wall Street, essentially into US Treasury bills and so forth, and by that means raises the value of the dollar and renders American manufacturing uncompetitive. They want to destroy that process. They want to manage flows of cross-border capital flows into the United States, and they've put it into Section 899 of the Big Beautiful Bill. I want to argue here today that it's about time that we started arguing that too, because we cannot manage our banking sector, we cannot manage our interest rates, we cannot manage our exchange rates, we cannot manage the creation of money so that it is used for productive purposes, we cannot do any of the things that you and I want to do in a world of capital mobility. So the one thing that I think we should all be asking for, and I don't like calling them capital controls, I want to call them the management of cross-border flows to secure the policy autonomy of economies. Thank you very much. I'll stop there. Right.
Can we grab a seat here? Is this working? Yes. Wow, thank you very much, Anne. There were some quite sobering thoughts in that. You mentioned that you would like to discuss a little bit about pensions and the pension risk.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about that, and then maybe we can turn to the capital controls, or that longer name, before opening it up to questions. So in relation to pension risk, obviously, all of this AI risk, which is landing on individuals' shoulders, is part of the equity market system.
Yeah.
And it's very a sort of provocative thought. What if we take that risk away?
Yeah.
But of course, it then opens lots and lots of questions about, for example, how do we fund pensions if it's not via the equity markets?
Yeah.
How do we fund companies if it's not with pension funds?
Right.
And do we have the kind of population stability to move to a pay-as-you-go system for pensions instead? So many questions. So what's the alternative?
Now, the thing is, Greg, you're asking me, I'm no expert on the pension fund market, but I want to say this broadly, that pension funds should be invested at home, should be invested in the domestic economy to help grow the domestic economy. To grow, by grow, I mean grow employment, and thereby to grow income and generate revenues both for individuals, households, and corporates, but also for the government, in order to be able to pay for those pensions in the future. And we won't be able to pay for pensions in the future in a world of low, insecure, low-paid employment. Now, we're creating a world of low, insecure, low-paid employment, which doesn't generate income for corporates, including pension funds, and it doesn't generate tax revenues for governments. But that's the way that Silicon Valley wants us to go, essentially. So for me, I'm no expert on pensions, but I do know what I'd like to see is an economy of full employment with resources and with credit flowing towards productive activity, which generates employment and income, and in which actually, all the work that has to be done to deal with the climate crisis is undertaken at home. At the moment, we're not doing that work because we can't afford to. We're so busy paying interest on our debt to the global bond markets, et cetera, et cetera. So the world that we would build would be pretty much the 1945 world of Bretton Woods, essentially, where we would be working cooperatively with other countries to maintain stability across the board, but where actually the goals at home will be full employment. I mean, I'm always struck, Keynes's book is called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. It's not called The General Theory of Tax and Spending. He had no interest at all in fiscal policy. He thought when you got to the point where you had to use fiscal policy, that was because you'd failed or because the finance sector had failed, and you should never get yourself into that position. But he also understood that employment is fundamental to the stability of the monetary system, of the financial system. So for me, that's where we should be going back to. And within that context, then I'd invite an expert to come in and tell me how best the pension fund should invest. I would recommend they invest in, for example, you know, restoring housing, whatever it is, what's called retrofitting housing, or shoring up flood areas or whatever, you know, because those will generate employment and income and help the pension fund earn the revenues it needs for future payments.
Hopefully we've got a few experts in the room today. It sounds a little bit as if the conversation is not so much about should pension funds invest in equities, but should pension-held equities be focused on the productive economy or the speculative economy. And back in soon after the financial crisis, when Finance Watch got going, one of the very first reports that we published, funnily enough, it was written by our Secretary General down there. It was called Investing, Not Betting. And there was some effort to try and distinguish between investments and bets. And at that time, we took a slightly sort of technocratic approach to defining the two, saying that if the investor profits when the underlying enterprise profits and loses when they lose, then, you know, same side alignment, then that's an investment. And if they're able to profit from the thing going belly up, then it's probably a bet. But I wonder, is that enough? You know, do we need to bring in some concept of short-term versus long-term, bringing fresh capital to productive use? Do we need more credit guidance? I mean, how far do we take this?
So, I mean, I think we need all that, but I want to take us back to, you know, the original privatization of pensions, which happened in Chile. So, you know, the privatization of pensions was part of the whole deregulatory process, which was triggered by the Chileans and which Margaret Thatcher then envied and copied. And so pensions are sort of at the heart of the neoliberal agenda. And I'm saying that actually, and then the invention of what are called defined contribution pensions, which individualize the risk of a pension fund. I find that terrifying. I find that so irresponsible. And what I would hope we would have would be defined benefit funds, which actually then collectively bears the risks and the gains. And I think once you have a system where actually we share collectively in that, you have something more secure for pensioners than you have at the moment.
Okay, well, let's park that one and invite the pension experts in the room to put their hands up later on. Let's move on to capital controls, or to give them
my favorite subject.
Perhaps you could repeat the full title for us again. For capital controls.
I call it managing, macroprudential tools, or managing cross-flow borders of capital.
Managing
cross-border flows of capital.
So part of your presentation is that international finance and the architecture around it, there's no sovereign boss who can say what's allowed and what's not allowed. And as soon as we're looking at this cross-border situation, then it's really beyond the regulatory perimeter. So how do we, in past attempts to manage this, such as Bretton Woods, it came a cropper, and so did its successor. So how can we put in place a system, bearing in mind the political economy behind this, that can survive attacks from very strong interests who might not support it?
That's a hell of a good question. It really is a good question. And I don't have a simple answer to that. I would say, you know, let's get behind the Americans. So what Stephen Moran is now trying to do, and there's a solid body of thought think tanks behind him on this, is confront Wall Street. And basically, we would have to do the same. And I don't think we could do it on our own, but if the Americans are doing it, we could pile in behind them. I mean, the real problem is Wall Street and subordinating Wall Street to the interests of the American people. Now, at the moment, they're not really willing to do that openly, but their proposal for capital controls is an attack on Wall Street. And, you know, what killed off Bretton Woods was Wall Street. There's no doubt about it. And it began here with Eurobonds. Actually, it was Britain. It was the City of London and the establishment of Eurobonds, which began the whole kind of erosion of the Bretton Woods framework. So we're as much to blame as anyone. But Wall Street was desperate, you know, to be able to buy Russian gold and wasn't able to do so under the Bretton Woods system. And so they cheated with the help of British bankers and with the establishment of Eurobonds. My God, I've just come from Ghana. Ghana spends, because there's now a continent-wide sovereign debt crisis, which is the worst ever sovereign debt crisis. Ghana spends 75% of her budget revenues on repaying creditors, foreign and domestic. And most of the foreign creditors are Eurobond investors. You know, so that we unleashed that beast back in the day from Britain. And that beast has to be put back in its box. Now, what it took to put the beast back in its box in the 1920s and 30s was two things. And I was really pleased to hear Benoit say this today. Number one, it took political leadership. It took, if you like, the heroic leadership of the President of the United States, FDR, Roosevelt. Roosevelt stood up in 1933 when the bankers wanted to reestablish the gold standard, invited the Americans to come to the gold standard, the reconvening of the gold standard at an international conference. And Roosevelt said, no, get lost, I'm not coming. And that destroyed attempts by the bankers to restore the gold standard. So it needed courageous leadership. But Roosevelt needed Keynes. And Keynes had spent since 1919. And the story of Keynes in 1919 and his attempt to rebuild Europe after the war, which was defeated at the Versailles Conference. And he was so angry at the way he was treated. And it was defeated, by the way, can I just have a little diversion into that story? I want to write a book on that story. The book's already been written. But so there's a guy called Thomas Lamont, who is known in his biography as the ambassador of Wall Street, who is advisor to the President of the United States at Versailles in 1919. And Keynes writes a proposal for a new international financial architecture, which would enable the restoration of Germany and indeed of the whole of Europe. And it's a simple proposal. Germany issues a bond for £1 million. In those days, it was worth a lot of money. It's backed by the United States, France, and Britain. That's all. That's all that has to happen. They issue a bond, and I promise to pay, and it's guaranteed by Britain, the United States, and France. That's all that has to happen. And he then specifies that some of that must be spent on reparations to France and so on, but the most of it can be used to rebuild Germany and reconstruct the European Union, Europe. And it's defeated by the President of the United States because Thomas Lamont sees the letter from Keynes, right? And he says, no, the United States can't possibly support this. So it gets killed off by Wall Street. He never knows this. He goes back to London, and he's so furious, he writes The Economic Consequences of the Peace, basically, which is a very... it's the only economic textbook that's still in. But so he begins to build the architecture in 1919. He's defeated by Lamont, but he carries on working, and he carries on working until he gets to 1933, and Roosevelt becomes president. And there, you know, is Keynes's theory. So the possibility of transformation in 1933 is B, political leadership, and B, a plan B. And Keynes was the plan B. Do we have a plan B? I don't think we do. And do we have political leadership? No, we don't. So we need to get, and we get both from below, from education, from mobilization, all the things you were discussing here this morning. That creates leaders. But we need leadership, institutional as well as individual leadership, political leadership, But above all, we need a plan B. And I was so excited to see that long timeline to 2030. It's not even long. It's 5 years, for God's sake. We need to have that sort of plan. And we need to know where we're going. Because, by God, the rest, our enemies have got a plan. You know, just go and ask Steve Bannon. He'll tell you what the plan is.
Well, it's good to hear that the timeline gets some seal of approval. And I think it's also important that the timeline should extend backwards, because there's so much we can learn from the past. I would love to ask some more questions and about how your proposals might avoid US dollar hegemony and so on, but let's not get sucked into that, because I know that there's going to be some questions from the floor. So without further ado, let's open up the questions. If you have a question for Anne, please raise your hand.
You might find there aren't any.
We've got a microphone moving around.
Brave woman here.
Yep, a lady here in the pink top. Here comes the microphone. If you could just say who you are and your affiliation, please.
Thank you. I'm Anna Kolesnichenko from FEPS, Foundation for European Progressive Studies. I mean, there are many issues of interest, but for example, about capital controls, I think European Union actually is exporter of capital in many ways. So what would be European policies? And we should stop sending capital to America. And a second question, so within Europe also capital flows cause lots of imbalances. So do you think there should be also capital controls inside the European Union or some sort of regulation?
Do you want to take that question now?
Take a few and then
Yeah, okay. Next question, gentleman there in the blue jacket.
Thank you very much for the very nice presentation. I'm Pettifor Dulgheru from Roma Foundations for Europe. Very, very interesting perspective about the international financial markets and the role of pension funds. I think, especially when we're talking about international trade and the role of the banks, now when you have Musk so close to Donald Trump, when you have the big tech moguls so very up and center, involved in most of the decisions which are being taken, including peace deals done by people who don't really have any reason to be involved in decisions which are going to affect millions of people. How can we actually regulate? How can we actually do the things which are going to be good for the rest of the people? I come from the Roma community, and the Roma community has been disadvantaged and kept in poverty for hundreds of years. And we're trying to see how we can improve their lives. But to be honest, more and more I'm actually being disappointed, and I actually lose faith that something good is going to happen for those that are currently now in poverty. And whatever wealth is going to be generated, I don't think is going to be shared with those who are really trying to make ends meet. So I really wonder, and I know this is a very difficult question, and I don't expect you to have the answer, but how would you comment? How can we really take back the power and challenge this multipolarity, I think is the word, versus multilateralism?
Okay, do you want to think about those?
questions, so yeah. So first of all, on Europe and capital flows and managing those, I mean, we already have, for example, in Britain, we already have, they call them macroprudential tools, but when the London housing market, you know, went crazy and prices went through the roof, the Bank of England demanded that foreign investors should put down bigger deposits than local residents. They had to put more money down as guarantee, as collateral, before they took out a loan to buy a house than locals had to do. That was a form of capital control, right? It doesn't get called that, it gets called macroprudential tools. But the effect was to cool the housing market temporarily. I mean, he needs to do far more. And I'm sure that's already happening in other parts of the world too, including Europe. But you're right about imbalances in Europe, and I think the imbalances in Europe have got a lot to do with the role of the European Central Bank and the fact that we have a centralized bank that is totally unaccountable to the people of Europe. I mean, I don't believe that's sustainable. I don't believe that in the long term that can survive. But who knows? On the question about multilateralism versus multipolarity is a very profound question, and you're right, it would take a very long time to answer. Can I say this to you? You know, I don't think there's hope. I think the way the system is so unbalanced and so indecent and so inhuman, and the way in which the fossil system is so unbalanced, is that, you know, crisis and perhaps even catastrophe is inevitable. And, you know, it's a dismal sight. It's a dismal thing. It's an awful thing to feel powerless. But I think we are powerless at this stage. But what we're not is we are thinking human beings. We have ideas. We have people. We have solidarity. We are building. And I thought what Christine Berry said was very important, that I know very well from 26 and 2010 that at that point there wasn't the state of financial and economic literacy that there is amongst the public now. And that's thanks to all of the work that's been done by people in this room and others, right? So that's quite hopeful. So we have those ideas, we have those people. The thing is, we have to be prepared for what happens when the crisis comes and to be there for the moment. What struck me about 2007-9, about the left, was that we all stood there saying, wow, we didn't know this could happen. We weren't ready. They certainly didn't have a plan B. We didn't even know it could happen. We were as dim as many of the economists at the London School of Economics who couldn't answer the Queen's question, you know. So we need that, and with that knowledge and with that solidarity and with what we're building, we can make hope. Because hope isn't something that just falls out of the blue sky. It's something that we make. And we must be prepared to make it. And that means we have to be prepared to cooperate and work together and to finance and sustain organizations like this. And not to give up, but to, while at the same time being very realistic, as you are, about how hard it is to transform things so that the poor get their fair share. But their time is coming.
Thanks, Anne. Do we have any more questions? Yes, there's a gentleman here in a grey sweater. And any more hands at the back?
Yes, hello, thank you very much for your presentation, very interesting. I'm Martin Schmalzried from Families Europe, Confessé Families Europe. I just had a question about this whole idea of speculation on things like artificial intelligence, and whether this is something new or whether this is a phenomenon that's been with humanity since the very beginning. If you look at the 1700s and speculation on the South Sea bubble, for instance, where Isaac Newton famously lost all his money, or the dot-com bubble also more recently on the internet, you know. But then is it this kind of period of exuberance and the Minsky moment where everything kind of melts up, does it only leave destruction and chaos, or does it also sometimes lay the foundation of a technology that is then cheaper to use? Because famously in the dot-com bubble, there's plenty of optical fiber that was laid down for billions and billions of dollars that was then left, quote unquote, abandoned because there was no use case for it. And then eventually it was picked up as infrastructure later on when the internet sort of really picked up. And so is this more like almost in the human nature, not necessarily part of the system, that we're exuberant in something new and enthusiastic, overly enthusiastic, only to be disappointed, but then something that settles across time? Or is this really something completely new which only causes chaos and massive speculation on nothing tangible, really?
Thank you. Great question. Do you want to take that straight on?
So there's nothing new about speculation, absolutely, but there is something new about the scale of speculation. And there is something new about the creation of credit, of $450 trillion of credit. The South Sea bubble guys didn't have access to that kind of money, right? And so the scale of damage they could do was not ever on the scale of damage that can be done now. And I think even back in the 1700s, there was some form of regulation. They were stopped in their tracks, and they were stopped mainly by failure, by collapse, and by the realization, you know, the South Sea projects didn't exist. But the damage that they could do was limited to a certain geographical area, basically. They couldn't do what Silicon Valley can do now and what the fossil fuel sector can do, which is to destroy the whole of, possibly, the human civilization. So we're on scale terms here, and therefore I don't think we should be relaxed about it. Of course, there's a natural amount of exuberance in financial investing, and we've always seen that, but it has always been regulated. It's never been as deregulated as it is now. We've recognized it from the days of Adam and Eve. We've understood that you have to, and the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are about thou shalt do this and thou shalt not do that, because back then we understood the nature of exuberance, right? But we've now got a system where there are no commandments at all. It's crazy. And in that sense, it is unprecedented.
And of course, it does bring up the question of other people's money. I mean, it's all very well to invest your own money and take a loss, but if you're investing other people's pensions or credits, which by definition is other people's money, then it's slightly different. Which does bring us on, if there are no questions immediately, I'd like to put a question myself, and that is, we've heard once or twice in today's sessions about the idea of central bank independence. It has its proponents and its detractors, but it seems to be that this is something that where we really can learn lessons from history.
Yeah.
What would you say as a student of Keynes and the history that includes periods when there has been credit guidance and when we've had, before central bank independence came in the 80s, what can we learn?
So I'm working on this actually with the New Economics Foundation at the moment, and they're doing some superb work on central bank independence. Can I recommend their reports? I'll just take you back to 1945. There was no central bank independence in 1945. So we get a British Labour government with a debt of 250% of GDP. There is no money. There literally was no money. And there was especially no money for importing from abroad and importing from the Americans. The Americans doubled down on our debts as a way of capturing British markets. And so it was a really tough time. And a Labour government began to nationalize the banks. The central bank, the first thing they did was to nationalize the Bank of England because it had made such a mess in the 1930s and had been so corrupted by the City of London. It was nationalized. It's still a nationalized bank, right? Secondly, they nationalized the coal mines, they nationalized water, they nationalized energy. They developed a school education curriculum across the board for free education. They invented the National Health Service. They built housing. And they did that with the help of a central bank, right? And gradually created employment and gradually generated economic recovery. Now, that was quickly attacked by the City of London, who did not like the diversion of finance away from the city and towards the economy. But they rebuilt it without a central bank that was independent. Independence of central banks appears with Paul Volcker. When Paul Volcker makes some very crazy decisions as a governor of the Federal Reserve, he lends crazy money. And if you want to know about this, and I've forgotten his name, but there's a banker from Texas who was represented on the Federal Reserve who hated Volcker. Because in his territory in Texas, his local companies were borrowing crazy money. And he knew they'd never repay. He knew that they were fragile. But it was such easy money created by the Federal Reserve at very low rates of interest. They were just grabbing that credit. And they were using it for unproductive purposes. And he could see that because he was a conservative old banker. And then the crisis comes. There's a big financial crisis. And Volcker clamps down on all credit. And he he ratchets up the rate of interest. All of these guys that have borrowed crazy money, high levels of debt, easy money, now have to pay very high interest on their outstanding debts, right? And our central banker from Texas goes to Washington and he says, it's all your fault. Right? He's written a book there's a book written about it. So Volcker, demands in order to impose that austerity and to stabilize and to deal with inflation, which he had caused by chasing too much money, chasing too few goods and services, the classic definition of inflation. He created too much money chasing too few goods and services. He then imposes austerity and demands independence of the central bank. And that's when we first get central bank independence. And that's when we get austerity as an answer to the problems. And that's where we get the acceleration of deregulation. So, how did the Labour government finance national economic recovery without an independent central bank? Very easily done, very well done through coordination of fiscal and monetary policy. The idea of separating fiscal and monetary policy was anathema to Keynes and to those people. The central bank is part of the state's institutions. It's not private. Its power rests on the taxpayers that are providing its collateral, right?
So how do we stop President Trump from using the powers of the Fed to promote his latest crypto experiment?
It gets very difficult here. I've worked in Nigeria, where the central bank is used by politicians to grab hard currency so they can buy a chalet in the south of France, right? So I understand you've got to be very careful about access to the central bank's resources. And I'm not arguing that central banks should be put at the disposal of politicians, but I am arguing that you cannot have monetary policy fighting fiscal policy, which is what we have in Britain. We're opposed. Monetary policy opposes fiscal policy. Fiscal policy opposes monetary policy. And we have what we have in Britain today, stagnation, stasis. We don't have anything happen. So there is a balance. This is not to say that we must have political control like Trump wants of the central bank, but Trump's got a point. Those central bankers are not working for the people of the United States of America. They're working for Wall Street, right? He has a grievance, and that's a proper grievance. He's going about it in completely wrong and also corrupt way. But let's be honest about that.
That sounds like an excellent provocation on which to end. Let's show some appreciation for Anne Pettifor for her fantastic presentation. Thank you, Anne. That brings us to the end of this session. We've now got a 30-minute coffee break, I believe. So please go and get yourself caffeined up before we move on to the parallel sessions after the coffee break. Thank you.